So we talked about the art of thinking on our first night, and I keep thinking about the art of thinking, especially since we had our conversation. For example, I don't know why I keep looking at this, because I know how things are going to turn out. But there was, on a website today, there was just a little video clip of a journalist interviewing Richard Spencer. Do you know this guy? He's like the latest white supremacist guy. Right. So, and then he's been punched out a few times on camera, but he's a white supremacist, right? So there's this journalist who says, "I'm going to go get to the bottom of this," and the tagline on the video was, "This is how you interview a white supremacist." I'm like, oh, that could be interesting. Art of thinking, right? Maybe you're going to. No, it's a 5-minute video where they end up screaming at each other. So again, one of the things we talked about that I thought about when I watched that video is McLuhan, the medium is the message, and how the very medium shapes the art of thinking, right? So what are you going to do in a 5-minute YouTube video? Are you going to get to the bottom of white supremacy and convince a leading white supremacist that he's wrong? No, this is pure theater, right? And it was. But it sucked me in. I thought it was going to be something else, but there you go. The Art of Speaking, where I dragged you through Plato's Cratylus to Jean Baudrillard's analysis of Disneyland and the simulacrum and the Matrix and all that, and you stayed with me and kept coming back. And then last week was very different and kind of cool, I thought, just the art of being alone. So we just kind of surveyed what people had said and thought about being alone. And of course, in community, because you can't talk about one without the other. Same thing's true tonight. You can't really talk about work without not work, which is leisure. And of course, there are some mythological stories here, mythological meanings to the nature of work. Starting with Genesis. Actually, I don't know if you remember this from Sunday school or have thought about it, but work is a result of the curse. It's a product of the curse. To Genesis 3:17, to Adam he said, I love this, because you listen to your wife, you have to work. That's the text. Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit. By the way, just so for the record, Adam was right there the whole time in the story world. Just in the story world. He was standing there. It's not that he didn't hear the snake, the serpent. I just want that on the record. But because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Cursed is the ground. There's a lot going on there that we could get into about Mother Earth and such, but we won't. Because the point is, through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return. So there it is, right in the Western origin myth. Work is punishment, right? And the punishment is for knowing too much, from eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This gets built into the notion of the Sabbath, right? So, again, this is from Exodus. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, it's a little problematic, your livestock or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So what's that about? God works? Needs a rest? needs a Sabbath? Okay, we can get into that if you want. Ecclesiastes, I love Ecclesiastes. It's the most philosophical, well, in terms of the language and structure, it's the most philosophical text in the Hebrew Bible. You know that line from Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity, right? And then the birds got a song out of Ecclesiastes. Anyway, we won't get into that. Ecclesiastes, this is what I have seen to be good. Okay. It is fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil which one toils under the sun, the few days of life God gives us, for this is our lot. Likewise, all to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and whom he enables to enjoy them and to accept their lot and to find enjoyment in their toil, this is the gift of God. For they will scarcely brood over the days of their lives, because God keeps them occupied with the joy of their hearts, right? So that's a very interesting statement in that, and not an unfamiliar one, right? In that you have to eat and drink and enjoy your life because the rest of it's work. It's the original thank God it's Friday right here in the book of Ecclesiastes. You know our old friend Sisyphus, right, Mario? Sisyphus. Sisyphus is a really interesting character. He gets into all kinds of mess, but we won't get into that. But you may know him for his punishment, which is to push a rock up a hill for eternity. Right as it gets to the top of the hill, the rock comes back down. All right? So here's the text. The now furious father of the gods, Zeus. Sisyphus is he's like the one who really gets at Zeus, you know. Nobody really gets at Zeus, not any of his wives or consorts or his sons or what. But Sisyphus really just seems to get him, just to annoy the hell out of him. So now the furious father of gods decided to punish Sisyphus for good. He asked Thanatos, the personification of death, to take him and chain him in the underworld. Then Thanatos went to Sisyphus, the king, and asked how the change actually worked. Thanatos agreed, but Sisyphus swiftly managed to chain Thanatos and said, see, this guy's really interesting. He tricks Thanatos and chains him up. With death now in chains, no mortal could die and go to the underworld. So, after a while, the situation aggravated. The god of war, Ares, unhappy that his wars were no longer feeding his thirst for death and feeding the underworld, released Thanatos. He then trapped Sisyphus and gave him to Thanatos too. And that's when the punishment occurs. So if you feel like you're pushing a rock up a hill and then it rolls back down every day, that's what this story is about. Work occurs in the Cupid, the Eros and Psyche myth, which I love, a fantastic myth. You may know Aphrodite's son Eros goes to meet this beautiful mortal woman, Psyche, and falls in love, and he shouldn't, he wasn't supposed to. And so Aphrodite punishes the woman because the woman always gets punished, no matter what the reason. And Psyche has to perform this work. She has to perform these tasks. And tasks become very important in world mythology. So she has to sort out this huge pile of seeds. She has to retrieve, fills a flask with water from the river Styx, etc. Go back to the underworld. So the notion of work, if we understand it as a mythological task, actually is a kind of ritual. It kind of moves you from punishment often to something else, not maybe reward, sometimes not. Or it's something you have to do on the hero's journey, as you know. You have to face these tasks and overcome them, and it's work. It's not fun. It's not leisure. And then, of course, our most famous worker, I guess, is Heracles, who comes across in Latin as Hercules. He has the 12 labors, that he has to perform. So it's built into mythology is my only point here. this notion of work if we understand it as task. And there's mythological element to it. Like I said, it gets you somewhere that you weren't before. So that may seem alien to us since we work for money, mainly. It had a psychological, spiritual, even connotation in our stories. Then there's Aristotle, who annoys me mostly because he's right so much, and I don't want him to be right because he's too much of a categorizer. He like puts all these boxes out there, and this is this and this is that, and I'm like, please, but he's almost always right. So he talked about scholae, or leisure, and he's the first, I think, to distinguish it from amusement. He says leisure, unlike mere amusement, involves pleasure, happiness, and living blessedly. Okay, now we're going to come back to this, so remember this, because the very last talk we're going to have is about well-being. And some of you may already know that I'm using a translation of a Greek word there called eudaimonia, which is again Aristotle's word that we would probably translate happiness, but it's much, much deeper than that. And so I called it well-being, following some other translators. So that'll be our last lecture, and that's what he's talking about here. Not just mere amusement, but I think he would say getting yourself in a place for eudaimonia, for well-being. Now this is Aristotle's most famous phrase about work and leisure. We give up leisure in order that we may have leisure, just as we go to war in order that we may have peace. We go to work so that we may have leisure. That's right, isn't it? Isn't that how most of us function? We go to work so that we may have leisure, just as we go to war so that we may have peace. That's a brilliant move there, because not only is it right, it emphasizes leisure as the ultimate goal, which we forget, don't we? Because you can get absorbed by work, especially in the age of email. And then there's a correct use of work. This is Aristotle. There's a correct usage of everything. And disharmony comes when you don't use a thing correctly, whether it's work or a tool or whatever. Nature itself aims not only at the correct use of work, but also at the capacity for noble, leisured activity. Noble, leisured activity. I think we should package that here at UPR and do workshops on noble, leisured activity. Since such activity, he says, equates to flourishing. He's right, isn't he? That's what really equates to flourishing. It's the starting point for everything else. That's not bad, right? This noble, leisured activity is the starting point for everything else. Everything else is, Aristotle's a utilitarian. He's a teleological thinker, so he's always thinking toward the ends. That's what I meant by he says the correct use of work. And so this is the end. This is the telos, the end of all your work is noble, leisured activity. Pretty cool, huh? Then there's our old friend Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, Stoic, who wrote one of the books I've been talking about, the Enchiridion. I think he called it Meditations, but it's basically a handbook for life. And that's what we're drawing upon here quite a bit, is his and Epictetus's handbooks. This is Marcus Aurelius, so he's very direct. And these handbooks are very direct. They're like, just do this and do that and don't do that. And so at dawn, when you're having trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What if your work doesn't treat you like a human being? Okay, but I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I'm going to do what I was born for? The things that I was brought in the world to do. Or is this what I was created for, to huddle under the blankets and stay warm? You like that? So it does sound good. Yeah, these handbooks don't really work in 2017 because that sounds awesome. When you find it, Marcus Aurelius again from the Meditations, when you find it hard to rise from your sleep, remind yourself that the fulfillment of your social duties accords with the requirements of your constitution and of human nature. All right. While sleep is something that you share in common with the animals devoid of reason. All right. You're right. This is a uniquely human thing we're doing with work. So you were born to feel nice, he says. Instead of doing things and experiencing them. Man, he would hate living today. Don't you see the planets, the birds, the ants and spiders and bees going about their individual tasks, putting the world in order as best they can, and you're not willing to do your job as a human being? Why aren't you running to do what nature demands? Brooke, why don't you run to work? Right?
I mean, totally run. We're doing things too. We want to decrease the entropy in the universe.
We do. That's very well put. That's very well put, yes. We want to decrease the entropy from the comfort of our bed. Yes.
We're figuring out how to do it remotely with the robot.
Exactly. Yes, we are. We are figuring out how to do it remotely. All right, so here's the last kind of dickish thing that Marcus Aurelius has to say to you, and then we'll move on. Here he is. I'm just going to say it. You don't love yourself enough. Or you'd love your nature too, and what it demands of you, which is to work. All right, I'm sorry I brought him up. No, he's brilliant. He's really genius stuff. I'm just going to mention Adam Smith for this one quotation. It's not like he has a lot to say about work, but you know Adam Smith, Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations, and Foundation of Capitalism. But I found this quotation really interesting about how things have flipped. He says things have flipped. Hunting and fishing, the most important employments of mankind in the rude state of society. I love how they talk back then, the rude state of society. He would say primitive, we would say primal, whatever. Become in its advanced state their most agreeable amusements. He's right about that, isn't he? And they pursue for pleasure what they once followed from necessity. So people in the 18th century in particular, and parts of the 19th century, were really interested, understandably so, in the development of civilization because they thought they were living at the apex of civilization. So they thought, now that we're at the top, let's look around and see where we've come from. So there's lots of interest in the rude state of society and in primal cultures or primitive cultures because they wanted to measure the distance that we had come as a civilization. That all crashed and burned quite literally in 1914 with the advent of World War I. So let's go back and rethink all this, and let's get James Joyce and Virginia Woolf to help us do that. But that's another story. Anyway, they pursue for pleasure. So once you get into an advanced state in society, you pursue for pleasure what once followed from necessity. In the advanced state of society, therefore, they are all very poor people who follow as a trade what other people pursue as a pastime. It is interesting, isn't it? And it makes some interesting disjunctions in our culture. For example, the notion of hunting. We have this weird notion of hunting. I'm from the South where that's a thing. And you hear all these discussions about, well, why would you kill an innocent animal? Well, I eat what I kill. Why? You can go to the grocery store. Anyway, so it's really interesting, I think, trying to recapture, maybe if there are hunters here, you can tell me, trying to recapture this sense of society that Adam Smith is talking about. But you're doing so from a luxury standpoint. That's a luxury for you, right? So like to go on a safari to Africa is a luxury. It's not like, anyway, I just found that really interesting. I'm sorry, but it's Sigmund Freud. So he did, especially in his book Civilization and His Discontents, which I think is his best book, frankly. Really interesting stuff about applying psychoanalytic theory to culture. And it's very short but very powerful. He says in there about work, no other technique, this is Freud now, remember, this is a big deal that he would say this, no other technique for the conduct of life attaches the individual so firmly to reality as laying emphasis on work. Work keeps it real. For his work, his or her work, at least gives them a secure place in a portion of reality, the human community. Isn't that interesting? I mean, I don't know if you've ever been unemployed, as I have. There's a thing there where if you're not interacting with people in a work mode, it's kind of alienating, right? It's not fun. But for Freud, this is nothing. Grounds us to reality more than work. All right. And in fact, there's a sublimating process involved. You know what sublimation is? It's where you repress things, but then they come out as something beautiful, like Da Vinci's attraction to his mother. That's what he said. All right. The possibility that work offers of displacing a large amount of libidinal components. Okay, here we go. This is Freud, right? Displacing a large amount of libidinal components. Remember, the libido is the life drive. It's not just the sex drive, but obviously that's a big part of it. Whether narcissistic, aggressive, or even erotic, onto professional work. So if you take that and you put that onto professional work and onto the human relations connected with it, it lends a value by no means second to what it enjoys as something indispensable to the preservation and justification of existence in society. This is huge. This is a bedrock feature of society, is work. Professional activity, Freud says, is a source of special satisfaction if it's a freely chosen one. Oh, that, right. If that is to say, by means of sublimation, it makes possible the use of existing inclinations of persisting or constitutionally reinforced instinctual impulses. So, you know, for Freud, work is healthy, or it can be, depending on how you use it. But as a feature of culture, it can be very healthy. And yet, he says, as a path to happiness, work is not highly prized by human beings. As a path to happiness. They do not strive after it as they do after other possibilities of satisfaction. Right? We do not, I don't know that that would be true today, would it? I think we do that now. Maybe not in the early 20th century. The great majority, he says, of people only work under the stress of necessity, and this natural human aversion to work raises most difficult social problems. Okay, well, already now we've got two different ideas going. Is work natural, or is our aversion to it natural? For Freud, it's the latter. For Aristotle and everyone else so far, it's the former. Are we born to work? Is it, or don't even put it that way. Is work important to us psychologically, spiritually, socially? Or is it something to be avoided? Is it a way to leisure, which is what we're really after? All right, here it is. Karl Marx. Actually, I think, for what it's worth, this is the most insightful thing that Marx wrote. He wrote a lot of insightful things, that some of which did not bear up under close scrutiny, but this still does. And it's interesting that it comes from a text that wasn't published during his lifetime. It actually was first available in English in, I think, 1959. And it's called Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. So Engels, his partner, his writing partner, kind of put these together, and it took a while for them to be published in Germany and in London. And then it took a while for them to be translated. So, Marx's point in economic and philosophical manuscripts is that work in a capitalist society is alienating by its nature. 4 types of alienation. I'm going to let him explain them. What causes alienation in work, right? First, the fact that labor is external to the worker, right? It's something outside of you that you're doing, right? So it's not something that's integrated into your life. It's something you go to. You go to work. It's not something that's part of your daily existence unless you make it so. It does not belong, Marx says, to his essential being. All right. That in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but denies himself. Does not feel content, but unhappy. Does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. How's your mind, Margot, from working at the bar? Yeah. The worker, therefore, only feels herself outside her work, and in her work feels outside herself. She is at home when she is not working, and when she is working, she is not at home. Disjunction, fragmentation. His labor is therefore not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. External labor, labor in which man alienates himself, is a labor of self-sacrifice, of mortification. Lastly, the external character of labor for the worker appears in the fact that it is not her own, but someone else's, that it does not belong to her, and that in it she belongs not to herself but to another. Just as in religion, the spontaneous activity of the human imagination, of the human brain and the human heart, operates independently of the individual, that is, operates on her as an alien, divine, or diabolical activity. In the same way, the worker's activity is not her spontaneous activity. It belongs to another. It is the loss of the self. Wow. Does that resonate with anyone? Not me, because I have a perfect job, but maybe you. All right, so he says 4 types of estrangement. Estrangement from the world. The worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. Think about that. And again, Marx is writing in the 19th century, so this is about the Industrial Revolution. This is about making widgets. Maybe it's true, maybe it's different now. I don't know. You can decide. But the worker becomes all the poorer the more wealth he produces. So the more widgets you produce, the less your labor is valued, right? Per widget, right? The more his production increases in power and range, the worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more commodities he creates, right? With the increasing value of the world of things proceeds in the direct proportion of the devaluation of the world of human beings. Labor produces not only commodities, it produces itself and the worker as a commodity. And so does in the proportion in which it produces commodities generally. We could go to the Apple factory in, what is it, Foxconn in China, and this would all be still true, right? So the worker is estranged, alienated from the world. The worker is estranged from production. This estrangement, Marx says, is manifested not only in the result, but in the act of production. While within the producing activity itself, how could the worker come to face the product of her activity as a stranger, were it not that in the very act of production she was estranging herself from herself? I'm helping Marx a little bit with his gender pronouns. The product is, after all, but the summary of the activity of production. If then the product of labor is alienation, production itself must be active alienation, the alienation of activity, the activity of alienation. In the estrangement of the object of labor is merely summarized the estrangement, the alienation, in which the activity of labor is itself. So if you are doing something disconnected from you, external to you, in which you have no return, right? You don't get back anything from this product. You're being paid for the labor, not for the product. Then alienation feeds upon itself, right? So you're not only alienated here, but you yourself become a commodity in the process of alienation. Estrangement from identity. Man's species being, he calls it. I think he's borrowing this from Hegel. Not sure quite what he means, but I think he just means being. Man's species being both nature and spiritual species, property, into a being, sorry, let me try it again. There's too many hyphens here. Man's species being, both nature and his spiritual species property, into a being alien to him, into a means of his individual existence. It estranges man from his own body, as well as external nature and his spiritual aspect, his human aspect. And then finally, the estrangement from the other. An immediate consequence of the fact that man is estranged from the product of his labor, from his life activity, from his species being, is the estrangement of human beings from other human beings. When man confronts himself, he confronts the other man. What applies to a man's relation to his work, to the product of his labor, and to himself also holds of a man's relation to the other man, and to the other man's labor and object of labor. All right, sorry, but you get that, right? So if I'm sitting there making widgets, and I look over and you're doing the same thing, we are also estranged from each other. We are estranged from this work because we have become part of the means of production. We are part of the system, right? And even when I look over at you and could potentially see a human being, I see a commodity I see myself, right? That's Marx. That's pretty good, right? We're going to come back to Marx in a couple of ways, so to Frederick Engels and to Max Weber. All right, Bertrand Russell, early 20th century logician, kind of a badass, wrote a book, very much a popularizer of philosophy for his time. Wrote an essay called Why I'm Not a Christian, or I think it's a little pamphlet maybe, Why I'm Not a Christian, in 1910 or something like that. So he's kind of a Christopher Hitchens for his time. Does that maybe help? Yeah, 1932, yeah. Wrote a book called In Praise of Idleness. This is satirical, but he's a philosopher, so it has edges to it. So like any good satire, it has a good argument, and it has a point, a very powerful point. But it's put in this wonderful satirical mode. So he starts the essay by saying he's very concerned about this sense of industry as piety, work as piety, right? Especially in the UK where he's writing. And he just wants to take that down. He just wants to deconstruct it. So this is what he says. I want to say, in all seriousness, that a great deal of harm is being done in the modern world by the belief that in the virtuousness of work. And that the road to happiness and prosperity lies in an organized diminution of work. We need to get organized to do less work. Right? Not wrong. But also a little edge there. He says there's two kinds of work. This is genius. First of all, what is work? He says. Work is of two kinds. First, altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface relatively to other such matter. You're moving stuff around, which is not wrong. Second, the second kind of work, telling other people to move stuff around. Genius. The first kind is unpleasant and ill-paid. The second is pleasant and highly paid. The second kind is capable of indefinite extension. There are not only those who give orders, but those who give advice as to what orders should be given. Usually two opposite kinds of advice are given simultaneously by two organized bodies of men. We call this politics. The skill required for this kind of work is not knowledge of the subject as to which advice is given, but knowledge of the art of persuasive speaking, that is, advertising. He's good, right? Third type of man. Throughout Europe, though not in America, there's a third class of men, more respected than either of the classes of workers. These are men who, through ownership of land, are able to make others pay for the privilege of being allowed to exist and to work. These landowners are idle, and I might therefore be expected to praise them. Unfortunately, their idleness, because this is in praise of idleness, right? So shouldn't we praise the 1% who do nothing? Unfortunately, their idleness is only rendered possible by the industry of others. Indeed, their desire for comfortable idleness is historically the source of the whole gospel of work. Remember this? In the Meanings of America, we talked about this, how that notion of Horatio Alger and rags to riches, that all came out of Carnegie and those guys who wanted to produce this myth of the virtuousness of work. The last thing this class of men has ever wished is that others should follow their example. And then, the morality of work is the morality of slaves, and the modern world has no need of slavery. All right. This is an interesting book. You may have heard of it. Max Weber, a German sociologist, called Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He's one of the founders of modern sociology. Very well respected. Did this not just for Protestantism, he did it in China and India, so with Hinduism and Buddhism and such. So this is going to sound a little fuzzy for a sociologist. Usually they're pretty precise, but let me just take you through it. So basically the point here is that he sees a connection, Weber sees a connection between Protestantism and capitalism. Okay? And let's let him explain it. So Protestantism is about industry, right? And in particular, he's thinking of Calvinism. So I don't know if you know Calvinism, but we'll get into it here. Calvinism is basically what the Puritans were. Industry, modesty, no excess in anything. And in fact, Weber thinks of Benjamin Franklin as the kind of epitome of this. Though Benjamin Franklin was not a Calvinist or a Puritan, he still preaches the mythology, Weber would say, of Calvinism. All right. Here's what Weber says about industry. The ability of mental concentration, as well as the absolutely essential feeling of obligation to one's job, are here most often combined with a strict economy, which calculates the possibility of high earnings, and a cool self-control and frugality, which enormously increase performance. Well, right? I mean, I don't know if you've read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, but we got into it a little bit in our Meanings of America course. Penny saved is penny earned. That kind of stuff, right? Well, that's a religious notion, Puritan notion, Calvinistic notion, that actually works really well for capitalism, doesn't it? I'm not talking about our capitalism today. That's a whole other. I'm talking about capitalism of the 19th century. Penny saved is a penny earned. All right. So industry, this kind of what he would call a Protestant ethic, it merges quite nicely. In fact, Weber will say helps to create capitalism. Remember, he says that money is of the prolific generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more, and so on. Now, I know that we know that, right? That's called compound interest and reinvestment and all that stuff. We know that, but you might find it interesting to note that for millennia, that was considered wrong. Money cannot make money. St. Thomas Aquinas called this usury, called it devilry, right? How can money make money? Money isn't even real. I'm just imagining giving a lecture on Thomas Aquinas at Goldman Sachs right now. It's a really nice image there for a moment. So this is a new thing in the world. The idea that money can make money and that it's a good thing. Not that money can make money, but that it is a good thing. And it's Calvinists and Puritans who say, yeah, let's save our money and let's reinvest it. And, and if you want to borrow some of that money, I'll charge you some interest. Usury, you see it in the New Testament. Usury is not cool. Adding interest onto money is not cool until the Reformation. Weber continues. The only way of living acceptably to God was not to surpass worldly morality in monastic asceticism, but solely through the fulfillment of the obligations imposed upon the individual by his position in the world. That was his calling. Okay. And let me read the predestination one too. Calvinist believers were psychologically isolated. Their distance from God could only be precariously bridged and their inner tensions only partly relieved by unstinting, purposeful labor. What is he talking about? Think about it. Now understand Calvinism. Calvinism there are various kinds of Calvinism, but basic Calvinism is the belief in predestination. That you are elected by God, and there's not that many of you. All right. And your first thought is cool. And then your second thought is, wait, am I one of those? How do I know? How do you know? That's an excellent question. How would you know? So it's this wonderful boon. Oh, I'm among the elect. Wait, am I? It's this terrible thing that you introduce into your society, or your religion in this case, where now the whole point of being an elect, of being predestined, is that you don't have to worry about anything. And so what's your first response? Is to worry about whether you're one of the elect. And it's a lifelong worry, because you're never going to know. It's maddening. Weber says that the Puritans, the Protestants, I should say, used work to know. That's how they knew. Okay, if I'm a hard worker, and if I'm a successful worker, I'm in. Okay, that's all cool. I'm in. I'm one of the elect. Because you see what I did? I worked really hard to see my bank account. That's not bad. That'll work, right? Because you're taking something transcendent, immaterial, and you're giving it a concrete, empirical sign. right? Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, you must be one of the elect. But wait, I work harder than you do. I must be even more elect than you. No, you know how we are. Right. So, yeah, I'm going to skip the aesthetic part because I think that's the most important thing is what I just said. Now, Weber was not an idiot. He saw where capitalism was heading, and he saw, that the connection was broken between Protestantism. He's talking about an historical argument. He says this: today, the spirit of religious asceticism has escaped from the cage. But victorious capitalism, since it rests on mechanical foundations, needs its support no longer. So he says, we've gone from this Protestant foundation of capitalism now to it's founded in technology, basically, in the mechanical advances. Listen to the way he writes. This is a sociologist writing. Really good stuff. The rosy blush of its laughing air, the Enlightenment, seems also to be irretrievably fading. And the idea of duty and one's calling prowls about in our lives like the ghost of dead religious beliefs, because that's what it is. Where the fulfillment of the calling cannot directly be related to the highest spiritual and cultural values, or when, on the other hand, it need not be felt simply as economic compulsion, the individual generally abandons the attempt to justify it at all. In the field of its highest development in the United States, the pursuit of wealth, stripped of its religious and ethical meaning, tends to become associated with purely mundane passions, which often actually give it the character of sport. Correct, right? Correct. Do you know Hannah Arendt? Exactly. Banality of Evil. Brilliant philosopher. Eichmann in Jerusalem. She actually wrote a book called The Human Condition, which has an inordinately large section on work and labor, and she is a philosopher, so it goes into painful detail where she separates work from labor, even. So she's like cutting it really fine. But I thought you might like to hear some things she says about work. She says, we are animal laborons. We are the working animal, right? And our work is never ending and also impermanent. So still getting at the alienation part that Marx spoke about, although I think she'd like to see herself as a corrective to Marx in many ways. But still, we work. We work all the time. We work ultimately for nothing because we're all going to die. So what do we do all that for? We are also, she says, homo faber, the making animal. We construct things. And that's the really interesting nexus she wants to talk about. She says, the human condition is such that pain and effort are not just symptoms which can be removed without changing life itself. Pain and effort is woven into life. They are rather the modes in which life itself, together with the necessity to which it is bound, makes itself felt. For mortals, the easy life of the gods would be a lifeless life. The ideas of the fabricator of the world, she says, which are permanent, stability, and durability, have been sacrificed to abundance. The idea of the animal laborons. In other words, when we work too much, we lose our creativity, basically. We live in a laborer's society because only laboring, with its inherent fertility, is likely to bring about abundance. And we have changed work into laboring, broken it up into its minute particles until it has lent itself to division where the common denominator of the simplest performance is reached in order to eliminate from the path of human labor power, which is part of nature and perhaps even the most powerful of all natural forces, the obstacle of the unnatural and purely worldly stability of the human artifice. And in fact, let me read that about, because that's kind of interesting. So how do we become, what is it to be homo faber, to be the making animal? as opposed to just the animal laborons, the working animal. She says, nowhere else does the sheer durability of the world of things appear in such purity and clarity. Nowhere else, therefore, does this thing, the world itself, reveal itself so spectacularly as in the non-mortal home for mortal beings. That is, art. It is though worldly stability had become transparent in the permanence of art, so that a premonition of immortality, not the immortality of the soul or of life, but of something immortal achieved by mortal hands, has become tangibly present, to shine and be seen, to sound and to be heard, to speak and be read. Right? So don't get lost in your labor. Become a creator, because that will last. Interesting stuff. Now, it's approaching 8 o'clock, so I want to get to women and work. And this is Marx's writing partner, Friedrich Engels. Really important stuff here on the origin of the family, private property, and the state. So, this is Engels himself. So, and he's basing his theories on, what's the guy's name? Lewis Watson, I think is his name. Oh, there it is, Lewis Morgan. Ancient Society, researches in the lines of human progress. See, I was telling you that they love this in the late 19th century, early 20th. They love this looking over the human evolution. So Morgan says that the fundamental human structure is a matriarchal, matrilineal clan, not family, right? So, and he studied the Iroquois, among others. And as people were wont to do in the 19th century when Morgan was writing, they tend to extrapolate quite a bit. And so he studied the Iroquois and then said, okay, this is everybody. He did study some others, but the point being that this greatly influenced Engels, and Engels is writing based on this. And so he says that, this is the important thing, is that it's a clan. And so everybody's responsible for everyone else, right? And this includes child raising. So my sister's child is my child. My neighbor's child is my child. So it's very communal. It's very matriarchal. Engels says this: the rediscovery of the original mother right gens, or generation, as the stage preliminary to the father right gens of the civilized people has the same significance for the history of primitive society as Darwin's theory of evolution has for biology, and Marx's theory of surplus value for political economy. So there you go, a little measured comment there from Engels about the importance of Morgan's work. So of course Engels is going to call this primitive communism, and he's not wrong. It is primitive communism. It's a shared clan system where everybody takes care of everybody else. No one has private property, remember, which is the basis of capitalism, private property. And so it's a communal, shared notion based on the mother or the woman. Now, I don't even like the word matriarchal because we tend to just flip it from patriarchy. But matriarchy is not the mirror image of patriarchy. Matriarchy is different. We shouldn't even call it or think of it as woman-led. It might be women-led, but even there's no, it's not the same kind of leading, right? It's women are the center of the society because they're the center of life. Duh. And so that's what it's based on. It's not based on a power dynamic, unless you want to call that a power dynamic. It's based on the basic facts of life. So, what happened? We've often talked about this in these classes. What happened from the matriarchal or the matrilineal or the partnership model, as Rihanna Eisler calls it, society, to what we have now, the patriarchal dominator society? What happened? Engels knows. What happened was the nuclear family. This is Karen Sachs, actually, a scholar of Engels. Private property transformed the relations between men and women within the household, only because it also radically changed the political and economic relations in the larger society. For Engels, the new wealth in domesticated animals meant that there was a surplus of goods available for exchange between productive units. Domesticated animals, I've got more ox than I need. You want to buy my ox? Now all this is happening outside the private sphere that was centered in the mother. It's happening outside. It's happening between clans. Now it's happening between the French and us. Oh, the monster is now loose. With time, production by men specifically for exchange purposes developed, expanded, and came to overshadow the household's production for use. It's a different thing to create something to exchange than it is to use yourself. And we go back to Marx and alienation of labor, right? As production of exchange eclipsed production for use, it changed the nature of the household, the significance of women's work within it, and consequently, women's position in society. This is Karen Sachs again. What happened to make this shift? The family. The original meaning of the word family, familia, is not the compound of sentimentality and domestic strife which forms the idea of the present day. Among the Romans, it did not at first even refer to the married pair and their children, but only to the slaves. The family was the slave in Rome. Famulus means domestic slave, and familia is the total number of slaves belonging to one man. As late as the time of Gaius, the familia was bequeathed by will. The term was invented by the Romans to denote a new social organism whose head ruled over wife and children and a number of slaves, and was invested in the Roman paternal power with rights of life and death over all. So what was lost was what Engels calls mother rights. Thus, on the one hand, in proportion as wealth increased, it made man's position in the family more important than the woman's. And on the other hand, created an impulse to exploit this strengthened position in order to overthrow, in favor of the children, the traditional order of inheritance. Mother right, therefore, had to be overthrown. And overthrown it was. The overthrow of mother right, the right of the mother in relation to her children, was the world historic defeat of the female sex. The man took command in his home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children, to continue the inheritance, to keep the private property. In order to make certain of the wife's fidelity and therefore the paternity of his children, she is delivered over unconditionally to the power of the husband. If he kills her, he is only exercising his rights. And this, if you've come across Engels before, is what he's most famous for. Marriage produces prostitution. This is Karen Sachs again. Engels argues that the frequency of sex between married men and unmarried women became institutionalized over time. Between married men and unmarried women. It, quote, flourishes in the most varied forms throughout the whole period of civilization. It develops more and more into open prostitution. Thus, side by side with the development of monogamous marriage, grew up the first commodification of sex in the form of prostitution, both products of class society. Engels says, with the rise of the inequality of property, wage labor appears, right? That appears. That didn't exist before. Wage labor. And at the same time as its necessary correlate, the professional prostitution of free women side by side with the forced surrender of the slave. Monogamy and prostitution are two sides of the same coin. Monogamy and prostitution are indeed contradictions, Ingalls says, but inseparable contradictions, poles of the same state of society. There have been feminist critics who have taken up this notion of women in work, and I want to read you just a few things and then we're done. They call it the unfinished revolution, beginning with first wave feminism, suffrage, second wave feminism, and third wave feminism. And listen to, this is from a great article called This Is Not Where We Thought We Would Be. Listen to the issues, private and public spheres. Women's work is made invisible. So child caring, house, caring for the house, other things that are not figured into the notion, the popular notion of labor or work. Middle-class white women become the norm for women because that's who gets advertised to, and for other reasons, we should say. Motherhood as identity, right? They're repurposing Ingalls for the 21st century. Equality of participation does not necessarily equal equality, so you may well be thinking that there are more women in the workforce. There are, but of course they're not equal in many ways primarily in terms of wage. There's also occupational segregation, wage and wealth gaps. I didn't know this, but this was in the article. The wealth gap is amazing. So of the women in the workforce, how many of those women are part of the wealthy? I think it's like 6%. I never even heard that statistic. Work-life balance issues, I think you know. And then unconscious biases, I think you know. I think we know. So let me end here with Walt Whitman, because he's Walt Whitman. And this is not my favorite poem of his. It's not even a very good poem, but I like what it depicts about us as Americans and our relation to work. I hear America singing the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his, as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing as he measures his plank or beam, the mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off for work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat. The deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning or at noon, intermission, or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing. Each singing what belongs to him or her and to no one else. The day, what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. All right, thank you.